Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Wish you a Merry Christmas and a happy 2018. On behalf of Prabha Khaitan Foundation and Tollyganj Club, I welcome you all in this series of Ek Mulakat at Kolkata. Ek Mulakat is being initiated by Prabha Khaitan Foundation in collaboration with Tollyganj Club, which will bring prominent personalities to interact with our club members and selective individuals from Kolkata. It's a matter of great privilege that we have with us the most dynamic personality of today's age, Dr. Shashi Tharoor. And with him will be our very own Mr. Harshavardhan Neotia to do the conversation. Both personalities do not need any introduction, and I'm sure you will enjoy the conversation. This is the second time we are doing this event outside the club premises in Taj Bengal. Thank you.
Well, good morning, friends. A warm welcome to all of you in this mellow winter morning, in this beautiful outdoors of Taj Bengal. And we have to talk to us today in Ek Mulakat, a very, very prominent Indian parliamentarian at the moment, but of course someone who has worn several other hats, of a great literary person, of a representative of in the United Nations, and a host of other accomplishments. So I just want to start, and I think I would request all of you to please join in. Whenever you feel like asking a question, just raise your hand. Try to make it as informal as possible so that we can get it a little racy and move from, I mean, there's so much to cover that 1 hour would not be sufficient, but let's try and make the best of it. So to begin with, Shashi, thank you very much and a warm welcome.
Thank you, Harsh, and thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to be in this conversation with you.
Thank you. So, when we were growing up, and I remember you spent a few years in Kolkata, as a teenager, I was constantly getting references and I was reading articles that you had written at the very iconic, the T2 of yesterday, which was known as the Junior Statesman. And you were perhaps 11 or 12 when you started writing, or maybe even younger.
Younger.
What got you started into writing at such a young age?
Well, actually, it was my childhood asthma. My family, I thought I turned off my phone. My apologies. I really thought I had. I born in London, moved here as a small kid, and unfortunately immediately started rather severe asthma. And it took a long while to grow out of the worst of it. And when I was a kid, it sort of was the defining feature of my childhood, in that I was constantly struggling for breath, wheezing away. Those are the days before inhalers and so on, so one had to actually pop extremely strong pills that forced open one's lungs. It wasn't a fun time. Now, as a result, I was more frequently confined in bed than would have been either my inclination at that point or healthy for a small child. Not able to rush out and play with friends a lot, etc. And remember, those were the days when there was no TV in India. There were no computers or computer games or smartphones. Even Nintendo wasn't yet a gleam in an inventor's eye. And so all there was books. And I started reading precociously young. I was reading comfortably soon after I was 2 or 2.5. I was also reading way above my age level quickly. Being the older child, the oldest child, I beg your pardon, I didn't have any choice but to dip into my parents' books such as I could understand them. But there were no elder siblings whose books I could borrow. When my parents took me off to the library, I would tend to finish the book in the car on the way home.
Wow.
So when you end up in like this, you can't sleep because you're struggling for breath. You can't be active because you're wheezing. All you can do is read, but there are no books left to read. So what do? You start writing. And literally, this is how it started. So I started writing stories around age 6. which were completely derivative of the kinds of stories I was reading. So I was a huge fan of Enid Blyton, the Five Fine Doubters, and the Famous Five, and the Secret Seven, and all that. So I created the 6 solvers. For some reason, she had left out the number 6 and all that. So I had the 6 solvers who are Indian kids having very similar adventures to these British kids in their stories. That kind of thing. And so it was, in many ways, for me, it was just a distraction, but I was blessed with a father who took it seriously, got a secretary to type up the stories so they could be passed around amongst friends. People seemed to enjoy them, ask for more, etc. And somewhat before just a few weeks before my 11th birthday, one of these stories, my attempt at writing a novel that wasn't really long enough to describe, deserved that term, based on the, again, inspired by the adventures of Biggles. Unless there are young boys here of a certain vintage, no one will know who Biggles is anymore, but Biggles was this flying ace from World War I and World War II, went on for a few decades. So I invented an Anglo-Indian fighter pilot called Bellows, and I wrote Operation Bellows. And the junior statesman then liked it enough to serialize it. Suddenly the next thing I knew was I was in print and appearing every week for 6 weeks in a row, which is as long as the story lasted. Now there's nothing more addictive than seeing your name in print, you know. It ranks out there with the first bite of chocolate or the first kiss, so you pick your weakness. and so I kept writing. That's how it started.
Wonderful. So you did convert your adversity into an opportunity, which is something that we can all take inspiration and learn something from. And then, of course, you went on to the US, and I also read that you were a PhD at the age of 22. Now that's the time when we hardly complete graduation. How did you manage to get a PhD at 22 when most people graduate at that age?
Sheer fear of running out of money. When I got my scholarship to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, if you just converted the dollars into rupees, I was earning more than my father was to support a family of 5 in what would have been considered style. Because in those days, taxes were so high that companies basically gave their employees everything in perks. So the salary itself was a very nominal amount. And it was so small that in America, my poor dad would have been below the poverty line. And the moment I got that scholarship, that was it. I felt I had to. So I raced through 3 degrees in 3 years, and the 3rd degree was a PhD.
Wow.
And it was entirely driven by the sheer certainty that if for some reason I didn't maintain the academic record that perpetuated that scholarship, or if the scholarship ran out, then my parents certainly would not be able to support me in what they were earning. So that's partly. It's also partly I've tended to do things in a hurry, and that's not always worked so well. But with the doctorate, I wrote a 660-page typed manuscript in about 7 months, with about, I think it was over 500 footnotes. It was quite extensive, and it was. I was also a well-timed doctorate because I had chosen to study the making of India's foreign policy in Mrs. Indira Gandhi's first term, and I began my thesis research just after her government fell. So it was this unusual period where everybody was willing and free to talk, and none of them were expecting to get back into power because she had literally just lost the election. So I had 2 extensive interviews with Indira Gandhi myself, and there I was, a 21-year-old graduate student. And I also had a conversation with every single one of her aides who had anything to do with foreign policy. All the 4 foreign ministers she ever had were still alive. The foreign secretaries, the advisors in the Prime Minister's office, Mr. Haksar, Mr. Dhar, Mr. Parthasarathy, the whole lot of them. And when I look back on it, I sort of do realize that it would be quite something to pull off the equivalent of that today.
Sure.
Even for an adult professional. If I were writing a book, I'm not sure I'd get all those interviews lined up. But somehow everything fell in place. I wrote the PhD, and it became my first book, Reasons of State. Subsequently, I joined the UN. In fact, I literally defended my thesis on a Friday, got on a plane Saturday, arrived in Geneva Sunday, and began work Monday. So I never had a holiday between my studies and my UN career. So I began working at the UN at 22. And then that became my life. So The PhD was a landmark. In many ways, I was happy to have it, but in the end, I never really did anything particular with it in terms of academic work, other than perhaps some of the habits of research that come with working on a PhD have lasted.
Sure. So before we get on to your UN days and some of the very interesting events that have crossed your life at that point of time, compliments are due to you because you're here to celebrate your son's wedding. You have a pair of twins, and is the other boy married too?
Yeah, he actually is younger by 3 minutes.
Okay.
But he managed to beat his elder brother by getting married 2 years before him.
Okay.
So now they're both done, as it were. We have this week of receptions across India. Delhi was on Christmas Day, Calcutta today, and now Trivandrum coming up on the 30th. And then...
So wonderful. So congratulations to you. Now coming to your very, very major part of your life, almost 30 years that you spent at the UN. And you moved up the ranks virtually to almost getting to the high table, to the topmost position, which you missed by a whisker. And I understand that this was the US veto which denied you that coveted chair. And when Condoleezza Rice was apparently asked why she did that, why she agreed to veto, she said she didn't want another Kofi Annan, and she didn't want a strong Secretary General. So what did you do such that even the US feared to have you as Secretary General?
Actually, I'm not sure it's what I did. I have the greatest fondness and respect for Kofi Annan. I think it's what happened was one small misstep from him. It was during the unfortunate aftermath of the Iraq invasion. Some of you will remember what happened in 2003. The Americans and the Brits, well, the Americans basically decided they were going to make an example of Iraq by attacking and taking over Baghdad, and the Brits supported them. Tony Blair attached himself to George Bush's policy. And they thought they would get UN Security Council approval to do it, so that it would be a legitimate war, a war authorized by the international community. To their surprise and dismay, they never got that support. In the way the Security Council works, of the 15 members, you need 9 affirmative votes for any resolution and no veto by a permanent member. The Americans and the Brits could only get 6. It was not even that they had a majority and then the Russians or the Chinese vetoed it, nothing like that. They could only get 6 to support them.
Right.
So after trying for several weeks, for them very frustrating weeks, the American generals told the president we should either go ahead or forget it. The president said, all right, you go ahead, we'll forget the UN. So they went ahead, and as you know, they had a swift and decisive, immediate military victory, but then they had all the problems of the occupation that followed. Some months later, or maybe even a year later, I can't now remember the exact date, I still remember the name of the journalist, Owen Bennett-Jones of the BBC, asked Kofi Annan, so what do you think about the Americans going ahead despite the absence of Security Council approval? Isn't that illegal? And Kofi Annan, as a good diplomat that he is, measuring his words, said it was not in conformity with the Charter. And the journalist said, you mean it's illegal? Kofi Annan said, I said it's not in conformity with the Charter. So he said, what does that mean? You mean it's illegal? And Kofi, in a very uncharacteristic slip, he's a very careful man, said, yes, it's illegal. And that hit the fan. That became world headline #1 for the next 2 days. The Americans' administration was absolutely apoplectic. There was rage, fury, anger, etc. And of course, global public opinion. The careful diplomatic language of not in conformity with the Charter would have made no difference to anybody. But a simple one word like illegal crystallized very, very strong negative opinion towards the American occupation and the American furious. And this is what led the Americans to say, quote unquote, no more Kofis. Now, when you think about it, it was a phenomenon of that time. In a different era, in a different mood, and a different administration, they would have wanted somebody like Kofi who could express ideas above the heads of quarreling governments and reach the world public, reach the American public, and so on. I had been trotted out frequently by the UN for that very purpose. I held the record for the most appearances on Fox News by any UN official. because I was able to roll with the punches and at the same time speak in a persuasive way to a right-wing American audience. So in many ways, I would normally have been considered the kind of candidate the Americans would have liked. But at this point, they wanted exactly the opposite. In a notorious phrase which is used about somebody else, not Ban Ki-moon, they wanted somebody who wouldn't make waves if he fell out of a boat. and that was the preference that came up.
So often the words you use, I think some BJP parliamentarian commented that he will, he's Englishing the English. I think that was
No, actually, I reminded Vice President Venkaiah Naidu the other day that at the peak of all these controversies, he had very presciently said, too much tweeting will lead to quitting, which is indeed what happened. But on the other hand, you know, they say that the ultimate revenge is that success is the ultimate form of revenge, because after all of this controversy, every single politician, starting with the Prime Minister, is now on Twitter. And it took Mr. Modi till 2013 to overtake me, but now he's about 5 times my number of followers in a different league altogether, and he obliges all his cabinet ministers to tweet. So what the BJP had attacked me for at one time is what they now realize is the right thing to do in 21st century political communication.
Sure. So now let's quickly go to your books, because I think we have any one of you would like to ask anything, because go ahead.
I'm just asking this because Harsh in the introduction said he hoped that questions from the audience would make things a little racier. So my question pertains to your assessment of the United Nations. To many people in the international agency world, the UN is considered a hidebound, self-serving bureaucracy that has done little to solve the real problems of the world, whether it's climate change, refugees, threat of war, etc. And especially in a world which we now foresee as being changing in a dramatically unpredictable form, that assessment of the UN would probably be even more true. Would you agree with that? Do you think?
No, I think that in fact, the UN at its best and its worst reflects the world. It is, after all, a collection of all the countries in the world. And what the UN does, therefore, is it serves as a mirror to us, to our agreements, to our disagreements, to our inequalities and injustices, as well as our successes. But by providing a platform for everyone to come together, it's been able to do things that could not have been done otherwise. It essentially prevented World War III, because the UN gave us a forum within which smaller conflicts could be managed and controlled before they ignited a superpower conflagration. During the Cold War, the reason the Cold War didn't turn hot is that both the US and the Soviet Union belonged to the UN and could use the UN mechanism to prevent their vital interests being affected by one or the other. In the absence of a UN peacekeeping mechanism, that wouldn't have happened. Similarly, the UN presided over decolonization. 100-odd countries owe their freedom today from the colonial yoke to the UN. The UN set the world's development agenda. The UN has become the agenda-setting forum for pretty much all the major issues in the world. We would never have known what the environmental challenges were without the UN Stockholm Conference in the 1970s, the Rio Conference in the 1990s, Kyoto later, Tokyo, all of the stuff, now Paris. There is a way in which the UN's convening power is unparalleled, unmatched. It's the only body that can bring everyone together to tackle the great problems of our time. How do you essentially blame the UN for situations in which people don't agree? If, for example, the superpowers of the world don't agree on solving a particular problem in a particular way, how can you solve it with or without the UN? So what you say is the UN is an imperfect body. It will work and solve certain problems where the major powers, and the smaller ones for that matter, agree and go along and give the UN the mandate, the resources, and the political support to make it happen. Then the UN is superbly effective. It's won a number of Nobel Peace Prizes. And not just UNICEF. The UN peacekeepers have won 2 Nobel Prizes. UNHCR has won 2 Nobel Prizes. UNICEF has won 2 or 3. There's a lot of UN bodies that have done very well. But where the world doesn't agree, the UN at least manages to prevent things from getting worse. As Dag Hammarskjöld, the second Secretary General of the UN, said more than 60 years ago, he said that the UN wasn't created to take mankind to paradise, to heaven, but rather to save humanity from hell. So you can't always get the ideal solution, but the UN's existence prevents it from getting worse into hell, plunging us again into a global war. So I think the UN has actually been a spectacular success. Unfortunately, people don't realize it because they don't look at it from this perspective.
So before I come to you, Anikta, just very quickly I want to go to your books. And you have been a prolific writer. I think you have 16 titles or 17 titles to your credit.
17th out next month.
Okay. And one of your best-selling books has been The Great Indian Novel, which has probably done some 42 editions. And your last book, or maybe one before that, The Era of Darkness, has been much hailed. Particularly your talk that you gave at Oxford has been trending on YouTube. It has nearly 4 million hits. And even Prime Minister Modi complimented you post that talk, which also possibly got you into some trouble with your own party. But would you like to tell us a little bit about just a few in a short summary as to what really triggered you to write that book, The Era of Darkness, and what do you really want to share with us as a synopsis of that experience?
Well, you know, I was invited to address the Oxford Union on a visit to the UK. The Oxford Union has this tradition where they have these debates quite frequently, I'm sure, but I think there's an annual one in which they get speakers from outside the university. So the teams are of 4 speakers each, of which in each side there'll be 3 outside experts and 1 student. So that was the occasion here, and the topic they chose was Britain owes reparations to her former colonies, which, as you can imagine, was going to be a hot button issue in the UK, and I spoke for the motion as the last speaker, so after much of the other arguments had been laid out. And I devoted my remarks basically to refuting the case that had been made in defense of the British Empire. So my speech was basically from a particularly Indian perspective, because on my side I had the Jamaican High Commissioner talking about the Caribbean slavery. I had a girl student from East Africa, who, by the way, became friends, and subsequently she's interned with me after Oxford just a few months ago in Delhi, a few weeks ago in Delhi. Anyway, so we had this discussion in which I essentially summarized in a few minutes the major responses to the arguments made in favor of British colonialism. So when they said, oh, we gave them the railways, I pointed out how the railways were a colonial scam and were designed to benefit British investors and were never operated to the benefit of Indians or Indian travelers. I took one claim after another: democracy, rule of law, political unity of India, all of these things, and I refuted them. And I did so, of course, with the kind of humor that Oxford likes and that the Indian Twitterati doesn't always like. A few jokes and then some borderline offensive remarks, but it got me a standing ovation at Oxford, so that's good enough. At the end of which I went away and forgot about it, but then they posted this thing on Twitter. I beg your pardon, they posted it on YouTube. And I innocently, as I do with very many things that I speak, and I tweeted a link. One never knows what captures the imagination of people, but this one just did. Actually, you mentioned 4 million views, it actually hit 3 million views within 24 hours. Wow. And that 4 million is only on one site, the main Oxford site, but it's been downloaded literally on hundreds of other sites and watched multiple times. There are schools that have played it to their students. There's a university, the Central University of Jammu, that actually held an entire day-long academic seminar on that one speech, etc., etc. There was a whole lot of, it captured the imagination of people. I'm proud to say that even today, now, good 2.5 years after I made that speech, people come up to me and say, you know, we watch that speech all the time, or we watched it as recently as last week, or whatever. So it has captured the imagination. Now, my publisher called immediately, within days, and said, you've got to make a book out of this. And I said, what's the point? Everyone knows this already. He said, what do you mean everyone knows? If everyone knew it already, do you think your speech would have gone viral? So I said, maybe you're right. You know, he had a point there. So obviously, people were not paying as much attention in history class as I was. So I said, okay, let me try and write an accessible book that summarizes these arguments. I didn't write a narrative history of the British rule in India. I wrote an argument. I essentially took the case for the various sort of my arguments for how the British had come to this country which at that point had 27% of global GDP in 1700, 23% as late as 1800, and reduced it into a poster child for third world poverty, how they deliberately presided over 35 million Indian deaths in famines that were really the direct result of British policies, how they systematically deindustrialized India, exploited and oppressed Indians, wrecked the textile industry. We were the world's leading exporter of textiles, particularly fine linens, muslins, and so on, for about 2,000 years. From the Roman Empire, there are debates recorded by Pliny the Elder, talking about how Rome's gold has all gone to India to buy Indian textiles and muslins. There are accounts in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries of the entire royal court of Versailles being clad in Indian muslins. English shopkeepers trying to pass off shoddily made European textiles as made in India, because made in India was the cachet for quality. And the British destroyed all of that, replaced it with cheap English-made cloth that they could dump on our market here, imposed taxes and tariffs and duties on the export of Indian textiles, but reduced them on the import of British textiles, and so on and so forth. So in every single respect, what the British did was, to my mind, condemnable, and I condemned it rather fully. And I also pointed out that all the things that were retrospectively argued as justifying British rule were without exception, including tea and cricket and the English language, brought into India to serve British interests, to perpetuate British control, or to enhance British profits. Not one thing was intended primarily for the benefit of India. So I made this argument, and that's what the book is all about. You're right, it's become my most successful hardback book of all time. It's sold over 80,000 copies in hardback, which in India is very unusual, extremely unusual. The only books that sell about that level are normally paperbacks. The blessed thing has been pirated so widely that even Amazon has been selling pirated paperbacks, which is really shameful for a big multinational like that. But anyway, so the book has found readers, and I can't complain about being read.
Thank you. Anigdan, you wanted to ask a question?
Yeah. Would you agree with me if I said that the one individual who has had the maximum influence on Indians in the recent, in our recent history, is not someone like Gandhi or Tagore or Nehru or whoever, and he's had this influence of people who even do not know his name, and the person I'm suggesting is Lord Macaulay. And if so, what do you think has been his influence on you, if at all?
Well, I'm not a fan of Macaulay, so I have to say that though I am the kind of person who some of our friends in the BJP would like to dub as Macaulay Putras. The fact is that Macaulay's impact on India, you're right, has been significant for two things. One, his advocacy of the introduction of the English language, and the second, his drafting of the Indian Penal Code. These are the two things that have affected Indian life profoundly. On the English language, of course, what Macaulay intended was never mass education. In fact, he said very, very clearly that we shouldn't spend the money or make the effort to educate the masses of Indians. We need to create a small intermediary class of Indians, Indians in blood and color, but English in taste and opinions and morals and in intellect. And that phrase was meant to apply to a very a small social strata, just enough to help the British administer this country, to be interpreters between the British and the masses whom they ruled. And I have to say that when you look objectively at what he accomplished, it was certainly not what he intended, because this class became not merely servants of the British Empire, but became the very class from which the rebellion against the empire started, because through the English language, they learned ideas which showed them how unjust, iniquitous, and racist the British Empire actually was. And so liberal ideas, the ideas of the liberal enlightenment of the 19th century, actually created the result that undid or unraveled eventually British rule in India. The penal code has also had long-lasting and pernicious effects. Things like the sedition law, which was actually toughened after Macaulay's time in order to make it even more oppressive, because as the law minister of the 1890s put it, the sedition law in India has to be tougher than the sedition law in Britain because it is meant to keep down the subject people, it's not for ourselves. So that's one example. Another is the section 377 on sexual behavior, which codified an idea of morality that had been quite foreign to Indian culture before, but which then has completely been internalized by Indians to a point that we are oppressing sexual minorities who in the old days had no problem in Indian culture and Indian society. There's also, of course, the Victorian patriarchal ideas that enshrined inequality of women in a number of procedures, number of criminal laws and penal procedures. So you've got all sorts of iniquities that Macaulay has brought in. But I would still disagree with your conclusion that from that Macaulay had more impact than anybody else, because on the English language his impact was indirect. The fact that a Nehru or a Tagore or a Gandhi were able to use English, it was still their ideas, their values and their courage and determination that made their impact on India more direct. So it was at best an indirect impact. And on the penal code, since the vast majority of Indian people don't fall afoul of the penal code, I think we can look instead at the impact of people like Tagore and Gandhi and Nehru, because the vast majority of Indians are affected by the lives they led, the decisions they took, the impact they had, because their impact has shaped the kinds of possibilities within which we are living today.
Yeah.
Hi. Good afternoon all. It's indeed a pleasure listening to the conversation. Dr. Tharoor, your strong, sharp and well-articulated words always inspires me.
Thank you, sir.
My question is, with the world today being a global village and digital media helping in merging the boundaries among nations, what's your take on one world, one religion, one belief? That's humanism.
Interesting thought. There actually is a Kerala preacher from the late 19th, early 20th century, Sri Narayana Guru, who had a very similar slogan of one world, one caste, one religion for all mankind. It's utopia. It's never going to happen because there are, after all, people who have been acculturated within different religions. And for them, those religions matter. They become part of their identity, part of their, not just their ways in which they reach out to their maker, but also part of how they are within society, within their families and their communities. And I don't think you can undo all of that easily. I would rather say that we should all make our peace with religion. And I find my refuge in Swami Vivekananda, who said that Hinduism teaches not just tolerance, but acceptance. See, tolerance implies a position of superiority, right? I have the truth, you are in error, but I allow you to indulge yourself in your error because I'm tolerant. Whereas acceptance says, no, I believe I have the truth, you believe you have the truth, I will respect your truth, you respect my truth, and we'll both live in peace. That, to my mind, is the right way forward for the world, and that, I think, is the lesson that Hinduism truly teaches, not the Hindutva of the intolerant ones who are now preaching a very bigoted and narrow-minded version of the faith. But otherwise, I think you don't need one religion as long as you accept that no religion entitles you to judge another or to condemn and least of all to attack another.
Any more questions from the floor? Yes.
You mentioned the Vietnamese boat refugees. Mm-hmm. Do you think the UN could be doing a bit more for the Myanmar refugees as well as the Indian response to it?
The UN is doing some things, but the situation is complicated. When the Rohingyas left, as a result of undeniable persecution, their villages were burned, their homes were attacked, their women were raped, all of the stuff. There was an immediate reaction both by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, who called in ethnic cleansing, and the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, who offered Bangladesh help in the refugee camps across the border. At the same time, however, all the neighboring countries don't want this to be a long-lasting refugee problem. They want the people to go back. You may remember that the greatest, largest refugee crisis in human history was the one where we welcomed 10 million Bengalis from East Pakistan, as it then was. And we gave them refuge, but Indira Gandhi made it very clear from the start, we will shelter them, we will feed them, etc., but they have to go back. And in the end, they only were able to go back because a war unseated the government whose armed forces had driven them out. Now, in the case of Myanmar, no one is going to go to war with Myanmar. So you need a solution that Myanmar can agree to that will permit people to go back from Bangladesh and from India. But the initial position of Myanmar is these people are not our citizens. They're all illegal immigrants from Bangladesh, let them go and live in Bangladesh. That was the big problem for Bangladesh. Because Bangladesh was facing the risk of being stuck with these people permanently on the grounds that they are migrants. Now, some of them may have migrated a century ago, some of them 2 centuries ago, and some of them lost in the midst of time. Because the Arakan coast, as Rakhine state is today called Rakhine, but known as the Arakan coast, have had sailors coming, including from the Muslim countries of the Middle East and indeed from India, for centuries. So you can't entirely pinpoint when but there's no question that most of them have been there for at least 100 years. Their loyalty to the Myanmar state has been suspect. In 1947, at the time of partition, some self-appointed leaders of the community agitated to be allowed to join East Pakistan, saying they are Muslim, they're not Burmese. Now they're saying they're Burmese and Muslim, but the Burmese don't accept all this very, very clearly. Now, at this moment, the negotiations that are taking place between Bangladesh and Myanmar are for them to be allowed to return in peace. And the Myanmaris have conceded the principle that where their identities can be verified, they can go back. The problem is many people have lost their identity cards, their addresses, everything else, the keys to their homes when their homes were attacked. India too has, the government says 40,000, the UN says 20,000 Rohingyas here. And India wants to send them back too. The UN principle is called non-refoulement. That is, you will not send somebody back against their will to a place where they have a reasonable fear of persecution. So what the government is saying is, we want to send them back. What the UN is saying is, wait until they can go back voluntarily. And most of the Rohingyas are saying, we're never going to want to go back to a country where we're treated the way we are. So this is the conundrum. It's nowhere near a definitive solution. We all know what everybody wants. But how we're going to get there is still evolving.
So if you are any other questions from the floor?
On this score, I just want to ask you, see there are about, I know, there are about hundreds of Rohingyas languishing in homes and in jails in all over West Bengal. And we have been told that they should be pushed back. There are threats all the time that there should be pushbacks. So we've actually done a public litigation case against the government of India. But what do you think will come out of it ultimately?
Well, there is a case, as you know, pending in the Supreme Court.
Yes, that's...
And I think international law is so completely clear on this. It is almost inconceivable that the Supreme Court will rule in favor of the government's stand. See, the government has made a blanket accusation that these people are all terrorists. There is not one shred of evidence for any terrorist act committed. There is not one charge sheet for even any criminal activity against the Rohingya. They should not be in jail. I'm shocked to hear that you say that some of them are in jail because...
Yeah, the adult males are still in correctional homes. Sorry for being not politically correct. They're in correctional homes. The children and women are in homes. And the case now rests.
So you can argue that this is illegal detention.
It is, because they can't be let off. And they were given, at one point of time, they were being given those refugee cards from the UNICEF, but UNHCR, but we were stopped at one point that they shouldn't be because the government had said that they should be pushed back.
So this is definitely a challenge. I have attacked the government's announcement that they intend to push these people back. The court, in any case, has said no action can be taken until they've heard the case. They're still hearing the case. My understanding is that because the principles of international law are so clear, and because the government is unable to show any national security interest that is truly affected by the presence of these people, many of whom are women and children also, I suspect the case can only be decided one way, and that is likely to be that they should be allowed to remain until such time as conditions permit them to return to Myanmar. I have meanwhile proposed a refugee asylum law in Parliament. And the reason for my proposal is that in every democracy there is a way in which an asylum seeker can be heard by a legally constituted tribunal, and the tribunal can judge whether there is a well-founded fear of persecution, therefore the person should be allowed to remain. No country is obliged to take economic migrants unless they want to for policy reasons. But they are obliged by international humanitarian law to take refugees. So if there's a refugee asylum procedure, you can weed out the ones who are national security threats, and there are some people who are members or active participants in the so-called ARSA, which is the terrorist or militant group from the Rohingyas that attacked a police station in Myanmar and triggered the attacks on the Rohingya villages. If there is an individual like that, that person can be deported as a security threat. Even then, he should not be deported to a country where he fears persecution under international law. But nonetheless, there will at least be a procedure. Right now, everything is completely guesswork. You're a refugee when the government considers it convenient to call you a refugee, and you are an illegal migrant when the government thinks so, and you're a national security threat or a terrorist if the government says so. And there is no basis for any of these labels. That's not acceptable for a modern, civilized democracy built on rule of law. So I think you'll find that very interesting. But the third one, whatever it is, don't read for instruction, just read for pleasure. I'm dismayed now to see more and more young kids whose only knowledge of books is as something required in the schoolroom. It's either classwork or homework. They've never read a book for pleasure. I find myself buying for 10-year-old kids of my friends books on football, if that's what they want to watch, or books on countries if they're about to take a holiday there with their mother. I mean, the idea is that ultimately the world that books open your eyes to is something that people must be brought up to see as a source of pleasure and delight, not just one of instruction. So that third book could be anything. It could be a book on cricket, and there's some wonderful books on cricket out there. It could be a book it could be a mystery adventure, a thriller. Read whatever you want to read, but never lose sight of the fact that that books are principally a source of pleasure. And my first two were really meant to be edifying. Right. The third is just to entertain yourself.
And three people you admire the most?
In different ways. I mean, I admire Nehru enormously because, growing up as a small kid in India, he died when I was 8 years old, so I can't say that I ever really had any direct significant encounter. I think at one point as a child I was part of a throng that greeted Chacha Nehru, but beyond that I never had any direct contact. But the more I read about him, and I read extensively for my 2003 biography, Nehru, The Invention of India, which I might commend to you is the best short biography of Nehru you can get, because all the good biographies are multiple hundreds of pages and counting. Whereas mine is a very slim, small book which you can finish in a couple of hours, but which gives you all the main features of the life, the more interesting anecdotes and the main lessons all in one short read. So let me do a little plug for it. So Nehru, certainly, I think he'd be somebody I'd be very, very interested to meet. Somebody I have met and worked closely with, Kofi Annan. Admire him hugely for not only what he accomplished in life, which is there for all to know, but for the kind of person he was. He is. He's going to be turning 80 in April of next year. I would say that this is a man who, without being Indian, had some of the best Indian virtues. He was almost like a yogi in the way in which he was anchored within himself. Neither pleasure nor pressure ever swayed him from what was the right thing to do. Extraordinary human being, and somebody who also was gentle, kind, very, very kind and generous with himself, with his heart, and at the same time very able. I think he will go down in history along with Hammarskjöld as one of the two best secretaries general the UN ever had. The third person, probably want to reach back in history. There never was the nearly man of Indian history was Dara Shikoh. Dara Shikoh was the ill-fated brother of Aurangzeb, whom Aurangzeb killed, and we ended up with a bigot as our emperor. Whereas Dara Shikoh was an extraordinarily enlightened figure who was in many ways the kind of ruler who could have transformed the entire impact of the Mughal Empire in India. This is a man who was deeply immersed in Hindu texts. He translated a number of Hindu texts into Persian. He was very fluent Persian. He wrote poetry. He cultivated people of culture, was a patron of music and the arts. He had a broad-ranging, humane vision, very much like Akbar. Akbar succeeded, we all know Akbar. Dara Shikoh was killed before he could come to the throne. We don't know enough about him. So I would probably mention him. Obviously, Akbar would have been there if you allowed me 4, but otherwise certainly Dara Shikoh would be there.
And now on a lighter
He
note,
also wrote Majma'ul al-Bahareen, mingling of 2 oceans.
Which was in fact the mingling of 2 cultures, 2 philosophies, 2 religions.
so now on a lighter note,
Yeah.
what would you name yourself if you were to have a chance to rename yourself?
Gosh, you get stuck with a name. I never liked my name, I have to admit, because of course the Macaulay Putras always think that a name that ends in a vowel must be a female name. So when I was working in the UN, I remember as a young man, if I would call and say this is Shashi Tharoor calling, I could hear Western female secretaries giggling at the other end at the very idea that a man could be called Shashi, which just sounded female to Western ears. So I was never terribly fond of my name, but now kind of, been stuck with it for long enough that I've been attached to it. And because it stands for whatever little impact I've been able to make in the world, I suppose if I had to rename myself, I'd rename myself the same thing all over again, just to be able to live up to who I am.
Okay. And what if you were to write a biography, what would you title it?
To be continued, I hope. Never want to give up doing things. Actually, I've resisted many requests, including one as recently as last year from a rather prominent publisher to write an autobiography. First of all, I don't think I'm ready for it in the sense that I'm still too busy and too active to look back with the calm reflection one needs. But I also genuinely don't believe that I've accomplished whatever it was that I was set on this planet to do. I'd like to give it a crack for a while longer. Somehow writing an autobiography seems to suggest that you're done, you can't do any better, this is it. And somehow I don't feel ready for that yet.
And last, a cheeky one. Which celebrity would you like to date?
I've been accused of having dated several of them I've never actually dated. So, I don't know, I mean, given that I've been sort of famous for all this.
A lot of them would like to date you, but I was just wondering.
Oh, I don't know about that. I was just, given that I've been made famous and notorious for my advocacy of 377, dare I say Narendra Modi, I'd like to find out, over a long drink and dinner, sort of what exactly makes him tick, and whether he is the person of the speeches, the person of the actions, the person of the results. There seem to be a lot of Modis out there, and I would love to have the time to find out which is the real.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor. I thank the presenter, Shree Cement Limited, Taj Bengal and the Calcutta Times, who is our exclusive print media partner for the series. And I would now request our very own Ms. Usha Uthup to felicitate Dr. Shashi Tharoor and Mr. Harshavardhan Neotia by presenting I don't know how to pronounce it, Uthurio. Sorry.
It's a pleasure being with you. And I speak on behalf of everybody over here. It must be so terrible for you to have people say sometimes such nasty things and ask you questions like you could change the whole world. But let me tell you, in our own little world, you really have impacted all of us in some way or the other, especially people like myself. And not many of you know that, and maybe you've even forgotten, I had the immense privilege and pride, I can say today, to perform at the UN when Shashi Tharoor was there. And I thank you with all my heart for that. I wish that I could be a publicity person and it would have been out like these days, they put it all out on Twitter and WhatsApp. But yes, I did sing at the UN when he was there. And let me tell you how much Kofi Annan loved you. We spent about 5 minutes together at the tea that we had afterwards. And he said, anybody who belongs to a little bit of Shashi Tharoor is a friend of mine. I'll never forget those words. And I sang an East African song for him at that time. So let me tell you, we all admire you and forget about all the controversies. It's been absolutely wonderful being here with you this morning, from all of us. Love you, sir. You want to date them?
No, I was going to say you.
Liar! He said he wants to say me. Liar. You've forgotten, but I remember.
No, I haven't forgotten.
Of course, then you never say it. So now go and say it. So on behalf of all of us, it's been absolutely brilliant. And the UN does think of entertainment to bring the world together, really. And yes, you also saved me that day. This I have to tell all of you because I wear a Kanjivaram sari. I was invited over there and they had this friskas, okay? And every time I went in, okay, so I left my bag, then I left this, I left that, and then finally they realized that my sari was full of jari. And the one person who came up and saved me for that, you have to put this on your Twitter machine or whatever, was Shashi Tharoor, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, who said, she's a very good singer from India, you know. Oh yeah. And this is the way we dress. I was so proud that day to be an Indian as I am today. And Shashi, we wouldn't want another name for you.
Thank you.
Just that.
Didi, one line from her. You can't take the mic and not sing.
Sing one line.
I'd love to sing something for you, which I did sing at the UN. It said, for all the troubles that went around the world, Sedation, I can't see you, yeah. It said, oh, we ain't got a barrel of money, maybe we're ragged and funny, but we travel the road, sharing a load, side by side. Oh, we don't know what's a-coming tomorrow. Maybe it's trouble and sorrow, but we travel along, singing that song, side by side. That really means side by side. Thank you so much, Prabha Khaitan Foundation and the Taj and Tolly for giving me this opportunity of being with you all on this stage. Thank you, Harsh. We call him the gentle giant.
And thank you, Harsh, for a terrific sport and great questions. Really appreciate it. Thank you.